I'm starting recording now. So a little bit of maintenance first. Anyone who doesn't want to be recorded during this session, please keep your cameras off and your mics off. However, if you switch your cameras on and participate, we'll take this as consent that we can keep your recording in all perpetuity and publish it wherever we like, more or less. No, I'm joking. Related to the seminar, of course. So it's my huge pleasure to introduce this seminar tonight. The seminar is entitled Aesthetics of Noise, Philosophy, Digital Culture and Artistic Experimentation. And it's a monthly seminar that started actually before the pandemic in February, and then we restarted it in October. I'm really excited that we've created a little group of people who've returned and contributed to the conversation. So I would like to invite everyone to feel that this is a seminar and not just a talk. So after the talk and Miguel's response, please feel free to be casual, put your cameras on if you want to. You're not obliged, of course, and to muck in the conversation about noise. So this seminar is a collaboration between the Collège International de Philosophie, where I am what they call a DP, un directeur de programme à l'étranger, and King's College London. And this semester we will basically conclude this seminar series on the aesthetics of noise with some more talks and conversations between philosophers, theoreticians, and very importantly, noisers, or we were just discussing what to call them, noise artists, noise musicians, noisers, or just musicians. The aim of this seminar is to reevaluate the boundaries of aesthetics at the intersection of philosophy, digital culture, and artistic practices. The seminar explores how noise partakes, or how our conceptualization of noise partakes in sense data, so in the aesthesis of our experience, and how it impacts our understanding of the subject of experience in its technologically expanded dimension. As Fisher-Black remarked in the context of finance, noise is what makes it difficult to test theories. It clouds our vision and forces us to act largely in the dark. Far from indexing a mere margin of error or simple disturbance, this seminar argues that noise has become a rallying point for contemporary reflection, stretching and renewing the aesthetic dimension of philosophy. I would like to also thank my co-organizers of this seminar, Patrick French of the Department of French at King's College, and Marc Coté of the Department of Digital Humanities, also Ika, and who has been tremendous in helping us get some of the videos online. So sorry to all those who've inquired about links not working. That's being resolved as we speak. And I would like to thank everyone who's been involved so far and say a couple of words about our speakers before we start. David Wallraf is himself a noise artist or a noiser or musician. He can clarify that himself in a moment. He's a researcher and theorist based in Hamburg, where he studied musicology at the University of Hamburg and time-based media at the Hochschule für Bildende Künste, where he also earned his doctorate with a thesis on noise. His book, Grenzen des Hörens, Noise und die Akustik des Politischen, which is here, Limits of Hearing, Noise and the Acoustics of the Political, has literally just come hot off the press, and I'm hoping very much that it's going to be translated soon. Yeah, and besides being active as a noise musician, he's also curated the very influential Noise Existence Festival at the Kulturfabrik Kampnagel in Hamburg, which is also where we met. I would like to also introduce his respondent, Miguel Prado, who is an associate lecturer at the philosophy department of the University of the West of England. His work resides at the intersection of philosophy, sound art, science, and technology. He responds to the techno-scientific, so his thinking centers around the techno-scientific and social conditions around notions of control, uncertainty, and information theory. He studies the problems of the meta-scientific and ideological foundations of diverse projects of prediction and control of uncertainty. From algorithmic surveillance back to cybernetics and how these render noise informationally heretical. Miguel is also a noise artist and musician, or a noiser. So having said all this, I welcome you all and welcome our speakers, David Wallraf, to begin his talk. And as I said, please everyone switch your cameras and your microphones off now, so that the recording doesn't jump between frames. And I will see you after the talk and the response for the discussion.
Okay, so I guess I'll just start. Welcome, and I'm very glad to be here. My talk today is titled A Concept of Impurity, Noise and the Acoustics of the Political. It will last for about 40 minutes, and it sort of condenses a few core pieces from my dissertation and connects them to recent political developments, especially in the UK, and something which is actually still going on. And I'm talking about the police bill, which I guess there will be demonstrations against on the 1st of May. So that's very current and recent. I didn't actually plan on that, but well, we'll see where it all adds up. Okay. If, as Robin James has shown in her book, The Sonic Episteme, acoustic resonance serves as a model for the political ontology of neoliberalism, then it seems like a good idea to revisit noise as a factor in the acoustics of the political. How is noise framed and conceptualized in general and specifically in current political discourse? Noise as an acoustic phenomenon to a degree escapes the logic of resonance since it is not harmonically structured. It acts beyond the logic of consonance and dissonance that informs a lot of the acoustical metaphorics at play in socio-political discourse. But it is nonetheless an agent in this field, and here it can work in different directions, both as a tool of power and oppression and as one of resistance and protest. In the following, I will argue for noise as a concept that is at the same time haunted and blessed by an inherent terminological instability that lends itself to a strategic adaptation in the socio-political field. For this, it will be necessary to revisit the different possibilities of meaning inherent to noise and their connectedness via metaphors, touching on the theories of Jacques Derrida. The conceptual fuzziness of noise lends itself to a strategical deployment in political discourse. To grasp this, I will use Michel Foucault's thoughts on power with its emphasis on strategy. This will lead us to an assessment of the acoustics of politically charged situations and the role that noise can play here. Noise as a concept tends to disrupt itself. The easiest way to show this is by a simple linguistic trick. Translate the word into another language, follow a few etymological trails, and examine the conceptual differences and relations that show themselves in this procedure. In German, for instance, noise is roughly translatable into 4 different, more or less distinct meanings, counting out possible synonyms. These words also denote different scientific, aesthetic, and socio-political concepts intrinsic to noise, as I would like to demonstrate with this cursory list. So, Lärm, lots of Umlaute in this. Lärm is translatable as loud or annoying sound, from the Italian allarme, alarm, and so on. As loudness, it is physically measurable and quantifiable. For example, any exposure to a sound louder than 150 decibels might be the last thing you will ever hear in your life. As annoying sound, it is an aesthetic and social judgment. But loud sound also has a political ring to it. This shows in noise abatement regulations and in socio-economical territorialization, like who gets to live in the noisy part of town, which social groups are deemed to be noisy, and under which circumstances is loudness perceived as the sonic marker of power and authority, and when as an annoyance. For instance, consider the Independent's headline regarding the UK's Home Secretary and the contested police bill from March 24th, quote, Priti Patel fails to explain what is a noisy protest to be banned under tough new laws, end quote. And we will get back to that later. Next one is Geräusch. It's any sound that is neither musical nor meaningful. This definition of noise sound as the opposite of music sound dates back to Hermann von Helmholtz's work from the 19th century, but is still used to this day. In practice, the separation of both is not easily accomplished. In a semantic system like human language that is basically built from noises, true noise would be any sound that escapes a given system of signification. Who is producing noises and who produces meaningful sound is a question that occupied philosophy from its very beginnings, like the theory of phone and logos in Aristotle's Politics. Similar to Lärm, Geräusch has both aesthetic and ethical connotations. A whole sociological theory of acoustic judgments could be built from the distinction of sound and noise, which social groups get perceived as more noisy than others, and so on. A set of racist, sexist, and classist framings of the audible. Rauschen shares its etymology with Geräusch, but designates a specific form of sound like white noise, pink noise, and so on. As electronically generated noise, mostly as an accident or byproduct in electronic circuits, it gave birth to basically all modern or 20th century theories of noise. It touches on the thermodynamic concept of entropy, Brownian movement, electronic engineering, information theory, and cybernetics. And lastly, Störung is translatable as disturbance, interference, malfunction, or nuisance. This is the principal meaning of noise in Shannon's mathematical theory of communication, and it is the definition farthest removed from any acoustic connotations. Though, as annoyance or nuisance, it can fold back into acoustic territories of meaning. Even though it can be encountered in concrete or empirical form, like audio glitches and distortions in electronic communication, it is also abstract to the point of being, how Cecile called it in her book, an epistemology of noise, ontologically arbitrary. These different translations or meanings can be understood as more or less empirical instances, each occurring in their own phenomenological, aesthetic, epistemological, or ontological domains. They create a network of differences but are linked at the same time. They crosstalk, modulate each other, and connect via metaphors, analogies, and similes. Though rhetorically incorrect, I will mostly subsume these tropes under metaphor as a shortcut in the following. But what can be said about noise as the point of abstraction where these instances interconnect? If we view them as forming a network or a kind of topology, noise as an abstract term would be situated in its center. Something like this. But this middle is marked by an absence of clarity because there's less of a pure or proper meaning of noise than a play of interconnecting metaphors that circle around this absence. The different meanings can connect and form different patterns of relations, but they do not form a conceptual totality. They do not add up to something like pure or proper noise. A space, a distance, a gap is a prerequisite for any relation or connection. It is this in-betweenness or the inter where noise as a concept is situated as a central empirical absence, an abstraction that is filled with traces of presence, of the empirical or concrete. Noise as a concept is impure because its conceptual network is woven from differences, and a pure difference is no difference at all. In a text on Antonin Artaud's Theatre of Cruelty, Jacques Derrida writes, "To attempt to reintroduce a purity into the concept of difference, one returns it to non-difference and full presence. One escapes from it, apparently, only by conceiving difference outside the determination of being as presence, outside the alternatives of presence and absence and everything they govern, and only by conceiving difference as original impurity, that is to say, as différance in the finite economy of the same." To my knowledge, there hasn't been a text so far that tries to connect noise with différance with an A. I think that would be very promising, but unfortunately it's a bit beyond the scope of this talk. But anyways, I would argue for noise as a concept of impurity or an impure concept. This, to a degree, is true about every imaginable concept, but noise is a special case because it actually does what it describes. It has a tendency to produce itself in a given discourse. As Douglas Kahn wrote in Noise, Water, Meat, quote, "Noise can be understood in one sense to be that constant grating sound generated by the movement between the abstract and the empirical," end quote. Noise as a concept is too entangled within itself and its diverging definitions as to privilege a single meaning, like stochastic noise, white noise, noise as annoyance, or noise as genre, and so on. The real noise, in quotation marks that almost obscure the word, the center of this entanglement is to be found in the in-between, between the different concepts that are bridged by metaphors. This inserts a momentum into noise that makes it dynamic and equivocal. Depending on the perspective, it can obscure or create meaning or act as an agent of both destruction and production. We should emphasize the dynamic relations within noise. Otherwise, the entanglement of concept fragments could lead to obscurity, like an idealized form of counter-meaning or a negative purity or pure negativity. The analysis of noise and its intrinsic relations can be viewed as a strategic process that plays out when noise acts as a part of a political situation, for example, disagreement, conflict, and struggle. In the following, I will try to outline a nodal point between concept, metaphor, and strategy. In white mythology, metaphor in the text of philosophy, Derrida shows us a problem that has troubled philosophy from its very beginnings. Philosophy strives for clear concepts with a proper meaning, for truth, but is plagued by improper tropes at its core. The archaic tropes or founding concepts of philosophy, like theory, theoria, and idea, eidos, but also the concept of concept itself, are themselves dead or effaced metaphors, since they originally transfer the meaning from the sensuous to the spiritual sphere or to sense. Philosophy must face what Derrida calls the abyss of metaphor, that constantly raises the question, what is to be defined within the definition? He states that, quote, metaphor is the moment of possible sense as a possibility of non-truth, end quote. But metaphors are indispensable for philosophical thought, since they provide the means of the expression of concepts that cannot be formulated with the existing lexis. The circulation of metaphors is tendentially unstoppable and, according to Derrida, threatens the whole project of traditional Western philosophy, since there has to be at least one fixed meaning, a primal truth or metaphysical origin. The play of metaphor must be given a center, a fixed point around which it can revolve in an orderly fashion. Derrida finds this fixed point or metaphor of metaphors in the sun. He deduces it from Aristotle's Poetics, where it serves as the best, clearest, most proper and natural metaphor of all. The same figure can be found in Descartes' lumen naturale, the natural light, a metaphysical concept that is not viewed as a metaphor in itself. But the sun is marked by an absence. It disappears at night. Looking at it directly can cause blindness, and above all, as a metaphor, it is in itself artificial. It does not escape the fact that, quote, any metaphor can be read as a particular figure and as the paradigm of its very process of metaphorization, end quote. Conceptual thinking or philosophy has to deal with the fact that its concepts are fluid, dynamic, and impure, caught in constant movement without a stabilizing metaphysical core or origin. So, how can we apply these thoughts to noise as an impure concept that lacks a center? Not so much a visual center like the sun, more like a keynote or central frequency that harmonizes the metaphoric transfers. Cecile Malaspina described the definitory blur or slipperiness of noise in her text, The Noise Paradigm. Here she writes, the idea of a paradigm based on noise raises a great number of problems, one of which is the slippage of the concept of noise. The problem is not only the lack of a transdisciplinary definition of noise, but its indelible fluctuation between theoretical context, as, for instance, its quantifying role in physics and information theory, its metaphorical role in the life sciences, and finally its role in probabilistic or deterministic theories. Never mind its role in aesthetic or altogether speculative theoretical contexts. When we try to analyze the role and functions that noise plays in a given social and/or political situation, we have to navigate its paradigmatic shifts and the intersections of metaphors that can be deployed to describe it. The entanglement of metaphors does not necessarily add up to an epistemic obstacle, though. From the place of the inter or in-between, their relations can, to a degree, be observed and titled. We have to take on noise from a strategic perspective. What I mean by strategy in this context can be explained by the definition of power that Michel Foucault gives in his History of Sexuality, where he writes, "It seems that power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization, as the process which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them, as the support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system, or, on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another, and lastly, as the strategies in which they take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus, in the formulation of a law, in the various social hegemonies. Power's condition of possibility, or in any case, the viewpoint which permits one to understand its exercise, even in its more peripheral effects, and which also makes it possible to use its mechanisms as a grid of intelligibility of a social order, must not be sought in the primary existence of a central point, in a unique source of sovereignty from which secondary and descendant forms would emanate. It is the moving substrate of force relations which, by virtue of their inequality, constantly engender states of power, but the latter are always local and unstable. This definition of power hints us to a conceptualization of noise that regards the socio-political sphere. In this context, noise would not have a conceptual center where a single proper meaning is privileged over other possible meanings. From here, the concept of noise can be developed that is dynamic, mobile, and of strategic value in the sphere of political struggle. We can find the metaphorics of noise at work in the situation of protest, unrest, and riots. They unfold among the dividing lines of a simple dichotomy, order on one side and noise as disorder on the other. This dichotomy can be exemplified by a quote from Brandon LaBelle's book, acoustic territories. The riot, the street fight, and the demonstration may be understood as dynamic instances of conflict and debate, as well as an audible interaction between writing, the dictates of law, and noise, the suspension of law, an interaction that lends to defining history. On one side, the law as a signature of written record, decree, juridical account, and, on the other, a drive towards its overturning, whose momentum relies upon, is initiated or calls for the development of a separate language, one that stands in opposition or that brings the law in its own hands. Thus, riots, street fights, and demonstrations produce an audibility that seeks to overturn or overwhelm the written record, the law and house rule, with a meaning determined by volume and the promise embedded in making noise. Such actions, in turn, instigate new patterns, aiming to reconfigure said rhythms with other timing. To break the law, then, is to also break the functioning order of a given system. This, in my view, is a somewhat romanticized notion both of a riot and of noise, but it gives a clear picture of how the acoustics of a political situation can be organized and how metaphor is used to bridge concepts, like noise as a metaphor for disorder, the written word as a metaphor for law, the written word or law as a metaphor for order. Reality, though, is much more complex, both on the sonic and on the conceptual level. I will use some examples from law, the empirical acoustics of riots, and technological developments to expand from Lebel's text and give an account of what I mean with noise as a strategic metaphor. In German law, for instance, a demonstration is officially disbanded when the police declares it to be over. This is written down in the right of assembly in paragraph 13. Quote, "As soon as a meeting is declared dissolved, all participants must leave immediately." End quote. What the law does not state is how this declaration is to be given. In reality, these declarations can be overheard because the police might not be equipped with adequate PA systems and the demonstration is producing too much noise. The written law fails to actualize itself due to a lack of volume, which usually does not hinder the police to start using force immediately. This problem of intelligibility is addressed by the LRAD, or long-range acoustic device, marketed by the company Genesis, formerly the LRAD Corporation. It uses so-called hypersonic sound, which are two ultrasonic waves that modulate each other and allow to channel audible sound like a beam, also called a sonic laser. The LRAD can emit sound levels up to 160 decibels and is used by police and military forces around the world. Genesis claims that its product, quote, fills the critical gap between the limited range and intelligibility of bullhorns and non-lethal or lethal measures for public safety agencies, end quote. This is taken from the Genesis homepage. It is worth noting how closely intelligibility is related to non-lethal forms of violence here. In later publications, Genesis usually emphasizes that the LRAD should not be considered a weapon, though it should be clear by its deployment that these devices, by the deployment of these devices during the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 and other situations of social unrest, that this is clearly not the case. In 2017, a New York judge ruled that, and I quote from the New York Times here, that, quote, as a projector of powerfully amplified sound, the LRAD is no different than other tools in law enforcement's arsenal that have the potential to be used either safely or harmfully. One example being distraction devices, items like stun grenades, flashbang, or concussion grenades. And if some of you didn't see footage of the LRAD yourself, or unfortunately have been in a situation where it was deployed, here is a short clip from 2014 from New York City, where the thing is used, but
If you interfere with vehicular traffic, you'll be placed into custody. Once again, this is the New York City Police Department. You must not interfere with vehicular traffic. You must remain on the sidewalk. If you do, you will be placed into custody. Once again, this is the New York City Police Department. You must not interfere with vehicular traffic. If you do, you'll be placed into custody. Once again, this is the New York City Police Department. You must not interfere with vehicular traffic. If you do, you'll be placed into custody. Once again, this is the New York City Police Department.
There are lots of other cases with video documents, but time and so on, and well, you can find them on YouTube if you are interested. Of course, there are other sonic weapons used by police forces around the world that lack the nimbus of high technology of the LRAD completely. During the Gilets Jaunes protests in 2018, the French police used flashbang or stun grenades, grenades assourdissantes, I think they're called in French, en masse to dispel crowds. The loud bangs of these sonic bombs nonetheless transmit a clear message without using words. Disperse, go away, surrender. The word order not only has a double meaning, it also has a curious function in language and information theory. On one hand, it is a reduction of language, something below semantics. As Elias Canetti has pointed out in Crowds and Power, animals can understand orders. Information theory does not concern itself with meaning, as Shannon and Weaver assure us from the mathematical theory of communication, quote, the semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering aspects, end quote. When the model of communication is applied to a political situation like the riot, it can be viewed as a system of power and force. The order has a special position in this, and in this sense, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari have attempted a critique of information theory. This can be shown in two quotes. One from A Thousand Plateaus, quote, the order does not refer to prior significations or to a prior organization of distinctive units. Quite the opposite. Information is only the strict minimum necessary for the emission, transmission, and observation of orders as commands. One must be just informed enough not to confuse fire with for. And in an interview from 1976, Deleuze has stated the following: language is a system of instructions rather than a means of conveying information. We ought, in fact, to invert the scheme of information theory. The theory assumes a theoretical maximum of information, with pure noise, interference at the other extreme. And in between, there's redundancy, which reduces the information but allows it to overcome noise. But we should actually start with redundancy as the transmission and relaying of orders or instructions. Next, there's information, always the minimum needed for the satisfactory reception of orders, and then there's something like silence, or like stammering, or screaming, something slipping through underneath the redundancies and information, letting language slip through. So, how can we frame the relation of noise, order, and communication in the situation of a protest or a riot? And what role can the inter of noise, its metaphors, and their strategic use play in this? Noise is associated with disorder and violence, or to reluctantly quote Jacques Attali this one time, a simulacrum of murder. But it is not situated on the side of the police or the side of the protesters. As we have seen, the police can deploy noise as sonic violence, and it does this to achieve a maximum of intelligibility, the opposite of noise, while protesters and rioters supposedly use noise as annoyance from the perspective of the law, and disruption as means of communication. It is not really feasible to argue with a law versus noise dichotomy like Labelle does, since the law produces its own noise, both as Lärm or sonic violence from the police and as Rauschen or informational ambiguity. For example, when Priti Patel proposes a law against noise, but stays ambiguous when pressed on the question of how she would define it. It is of strategical importance how noise is framed, where it is located, and which groups are deemed as being noisy. From this perspective, Patel's inability to give a concrete definition of noise to journalists is actually not a failure, but the strategy in itself. The vagueness of Clause 67 of the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill reflects this. Quote, to broaden the range of circumstances in which the police can impose conditions on the use of noise at a public procession or public assembly or a one-person protest, to include where police reasonably believe the noise generated by persons taking part may have a significant detrimental impact on persons in the vicinity or cause a serious disruption to the running of an organization. End quote. Instead, I want to argue for an open and dynamic conceptualization of noise that mirrors the impure differences between its concept fragments and keeps the space of the inter open. If noise can be read as a strategic multiplicity of force relations and also of resistances, Its theory should also be dynamic and aware of the ever-changing relations and metaphorical movements that constitute it. I want to conclude this talk and commence our discussion after Miguel's response with yet another translation of noise. The Greek word torubos, in its contemporary use, carries with it a similar ambiguity as the English word noise and shares the different meanings when translated to a language like German. But in Old Greek, it also designated a specific form of political praxis. The Greek scholar Ilias Anatoglou informs us that torubos was an essential feature of social activity in the ancient Greek world. Several scholars emphasize the role of torubos in the working of Athenian democracy in the assembly and in the law courts. Taken claims that torubos, that is, cases when speakers interrupt each other, demos, the people, interrupt speakers, demos, allies with opposing speakers, was an integral feature of assembly debate and, by extension, of Athenian democracy. Here we have a definition of noise that shows a line of escape from the dichotomies of noise and order. A noise that is at the same time a disruption and an integral feature of a political process, an audible expression of disagreement and dissent that guarantees the basic functions of political process. It is in this context that Martin Luther King's sentence, "A riot is the language of the unheard," has to be understood. And that's it from my part so far. And yeah, I'm curious and excited about Miguel's response. And thank you all for your attention.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, you go ahead. I just wanted to say thank you very much, David. I really appreciate it and took lots of notes. And I'm glad I have your book close to me to look some of the things up, and it's recorded so we can listen to it again. I invite Miguel now with his response and remind everyone to muck in the conversation and what is it? Torubos. To practice torubos in this seminar.
Well, thank you, David, because it was a really interesting presentation. And thank you, Cecile, for inviting me again. It's really nice, and it's really nice that there are a lot of people here for this seminar. So I prepare a response that I don't have a lot to add to David's presentation in his particular line of work, but I thought about a context in which I work that I think I can problematize a little bit this notion of, this metaphoric use of the notion of noise. So what I am going to do is to give some light to this context of French cybernetics as a proliferation of concepts and metaphors by tracking its origins in the development of a group of intellectuals known as Group de 10. Because I think this is important, because as David said, forgive me because I am going to repeat this point that I found very interesting. He said, when we try to analyze the role and functions that noise plays in a given social and or political situation, we have to navigate its paradigmatic shifts and the intersections of metaphors that can be deployed to describe it. This is the end of David's quotes. And in my opinion, the limitations of the current contemporary socio-political imaginary can be witnessed with regards to the not so new disruptive, not so neo-cybernetic models and practices of governance that culminate in the various present forms of algorithmic stirring that we can see. And because politics is hereby understood, I think, mainly as a sort of automatically processing system, or can be understood as this, of coordination that always reacts to irritations. And obviously one of these massive irritations during at least the 20th century was May 68 and the aftermath of this. So in this context, this group that is, was formed as a sort of interdisciplinary group applying cybernetics to society and politics. And they thought that May 68 represented the end of an era where politics, mass democratic politics in particular, would serve as a motive force in the transformation of French society. So they tried to envision a new society in which science would be an instrument to resolve social crises and guarantee successful social management, etc. A lot of these people were influenced by von Forster's order from noise principle, and his work features prominently in the work of some of the key members of the group that I should mention, like Henriette Lärm, Edgar Morin, Jacques Attali, maybe the most famous for us would be Michel Serres. So by the time the group disbanded in 1976, they clearly paved the ground for a, let's say, significantly fertile theoretical framework of noise in which I think we still live somehow. And I think some of these readings of noise are very interesting and as well problematic, and maybe we need to start to discuss some of these interpretations. I will cover some aspects that I think are interesting. Edgar Morin, maybe you know this, he intended to reinforce this idea under which all that is unpredictable and contingent in the operation of systems, like the ambiguities, uncertainties, and noise of the environment, pose for him like questions, problems, puzzles, charades to living beings who, in response, he says, we develop communicative networks that weave together in the ecosystem and thereby contribute to the enrichment of the general eco-communication. This sounds pretty much like classical cybernetics interpretation of uncertainty and noise, but it's interesting how he, in his work from 73, Le Paradigme Perdu, characterizes the evolution of Homo sapiens by a massive increase in disorder, as well as a psychological and affective outbreak of violence. So for him, social complexity draws attention to the widespread presence of noise in the form of uncertainty and struggle. These societies that we might call primitive societies provide evidence for him of almost like Brownian motion of noise, of the deficient inclusion of individuals and pervasive confrontation that offers a kind of, he says, metabolic richness. So according to him, this implies that it's not just that this biological inheritance that primates passed on to humans, but also includes crucial cultural heritage. Error, I think we must agree, simply put, for him is like part of our human nature. And as I think we have scientific evidence, is co-constitutive of the evolution of all life on Earth. Henry Atlan acknowledged the efforts that Morin put mapping these frontiers of a new paradigm of complexity, but I think rightly pointed out that there is an inclination towards the positive, productive potencies of order. Precisely because of this, Morin ends overlooking the relevance of creating methods of reproduction, social reproduction and repetition. And continuing with this context, in 1977, Jacques Attali published this very well-known book, Noise, the Political Economy of Music. And in his book, he highlights that far from being, obviously, a strictly negative event, this flooding of information with noise is capable of constructing new levels of information complexity, new forms of political, social, economic, or artistic organization. And he emphasizes the relevance of this method of approaching noise as the driving force of a vast plurality of crises, out of which novel forms of organization of increased complexity emerge. And I think here both Morin and Atlan are reinforcing an idea that can be very problematic. The idea that noise might not only be refractory, okay, but also creative power. Creative power enabled by noise, and that enables noise. And he does this by offering a sort of interpretative template for grand-scale historical changes. Maybe you read this book and you already know this, but he identifies like different roles under which noise can be explained as an index of life, as originary chaos, as unformed energy, as violence, as catalyst, as catastrophe, etc. And all share this common ground of creation of order out of noise, because obviously they were very influenced by von Forster, Atlan, etc. And well, the tradition of Prigogine, as well as Monod. So this creation of order out of noise is responsible for what they see as a sequential rhythm of destruction and reconstruction that pushes through the transition between the four historical regimes that Attali identifies in his book, from sacrifice via representation and repetition to the decisive idealistic regime of composition. And I find very interesting to now reread his diagnosis in the light of his role in French politics. As you may know, after the election of François Mitterrand in 1981, As president of the French Republic, he took the role of a special advisor to the president for 10 years. And in this context, between 81 and 91, he presented the proposal for the creation of CESTAS. The translation would be something like Center for Studies of Advanced Systems and Technologies, that were motivated, these studies, by the gatherings and discussions held by Group Detis, conscious of the priority position that the computing revolution should have in the political agenda. He requested at Ali the foundation of a center for forecasting and facilitating decision-making that led to the creation of this European technological cooperation project called Eureka in 85. And since then, he continued to provide economic advice to the French presidency. Sarkozy nominated him the head of the Commission to promote French growth. Hollande requested him a report on the concept of positive economy. Actually, Attali, this is funny, even claims the invention of Macron. In 2017, he said, Emmanuel Macron, I discovered him, I invented him. So yeah, Gilles Châtelet, that I really like, who described Attali as one of the most zealous acrobat intellectuals of the future global neurocracy, brilliantly, in my opinion, pointed out the dark and disturbing political reverberations of how Attali's program, and I quote, aims to mask a crucial dissymmetry in the givens of a problem in order to stage the miracle of auto-emergence. This dissymmetry, or we could say asymmetry, is given from the start, which vitiates the thesis of the gardeners of chaos, that I guess he's talking about all these guys, who would see in such examples a refutation of Boltzmann's principle of increasing entropy. End of the quote. So the last figure that I need to mention, obviously, here would be Michel Serres, who shared this view, Atlan's view of positive equivocation as a stimuli for increased organization, as well as understanding this Shannon's reading of enemies and noise. And he deployed, as you may know, this concept, the parasite. He introduced this notion at the beginning in the early volumes of his series Hermes at the beginning of the 80s. Well, and obtained notoriety for the account he provides in his book Le Parasite. And we can see how this Shannon's notion of the enemy cryptanalyst reverberates here, just like noise, is both parasite on, like relating to our relation, and paradox of communication systems. Because for Serres, they are configured against a background of chaotic noise and violence. Again, the same image that Maureen already had in his mind. And they take shape in the conflicts of different classes and circles to defend their own conceptions of truth, trying to receive like social for conquering it. Serres tried to establish the grounds of a general theory of communication that, in my opinion, privilege noise over information. And in order to do this, he introduced this idea of the third player in the arrangement of a dialogue. He states, very famous, this quote, I quote, "To hold a dialogue is to suppose a third man and seek to exclude him." a successful communication is the exclusion of the third man. We might call this third man the demon, the prosopopeia of noise. End of the quote. So Serre conceives his idea of a third man, the parasite, the unwelcome guest, through the law of the excluded middle of Boolean logic. So following maths, we can exclude a third possibility between true and false. According to that, we can see dialogues unfolding from the exclusion of a third man who jeopardizes effective communication. And he reintroduces this player into the language game, deconstructing the due order that qualifies information over noise, according to him. And the way in which he operates the third man, the third man in very different application fields, from thermodynamics to communication systems, economics, even he wrote about angels, is, in my opinion, extensively promiscuous. Because since its originary transposition from information theory, Serre takes advantage of the scientific misunifications of noise, and thanks to these liminal equivocations, his theory of the parasite emerged as a sort of universal screening element, in a way that I find very weird, with the capacity to assess the distinctions between different types of exchanges. So the parasite is any disruption of a relation, and whatever diverts the accomplishment of an objective for good or for bad, and whatever disrupts a third, regardless its magnitude. So he says, and I quote here, "The parasite brings us into the vicinity of the simplest and most general operator on the variable of systems. It makes them fluctuate by their differential distances." End of the quote. So for him, what qualifies channel and parasite, or information and noise, or relation and relation to the relation, is a function of position or point of view. And this could be understood as Mary Douglas' very well-known image. Just as dirt is matter out of place, we may say that noise is information out of place. But this presupposes a channel, an information encrypted and encoded message. This presupposes and takes as a given a lot of stuff. So the problem is how Serre's own rhetoric of noise itself parasites the generalization of scientific models of noise and the error in the transposition of noise between fields. His parasite can be, by his own definition, everything, like jack of all trades, noise or signal, enemy and friend, code or channel, edge or node. And for me, his metaphor, and in general, group that this metaphor remains uninstructive. And well, yeah, decades later, however, you know that the terminology that the group developed at the beginning to challenge technocracy and to promote contingency would lay the foundation for a new positivism that was and is perfectly at home in the 21st century in the French society, because they produce something that we could call like a literal post-structuralism, one not housed in American literature departments, but rather very much at home in the techno-scientific center of the French state. So what I try to do, in opposition to these neo-positivist ontologies that decide in a really spurious way on the obtaining or non-obtaining of some being, is, I guess, a multi-value process similar to David's talk that urged to consider obtaining and non-obtaining are amongst the indiscrete quantity of system possibilities. And when we propose and take side in this Manichaean characterization of noise, in here as the enemy of information or a simplistic mystification of its disruptive potentialities, I think is this very Manichaeanism as an artifact of classical cybernetics from the May conferences, for example, that is the responsible for having rendered noise informationally heretical in the first place. And yeah, that's basically my response. Yeah, I am really looking forward to hear your questions to David's presentation.
Oops. We're back. Amazing. Thank you so much. I think this is
You're welcome.
This is going to be quite something to weave the two together. But I think it's interesting that you ended on this point of multi-value processes, and where you say you see a connection with this strategic multiplicity in the use of the concept of noise. Obviously, as you know, I would completely the move away from a Manichaean logic is very much what I have been thinking about as well. So it's interesting that this dynamical multiplicity with the added element of a strategic navigation through this multiplicity and of a conceived as a multi-value process, even though you're talking about relatively different domains here, that seems to be an interesting alternative to the Manichaean logic. So I would like at this point very much to invite guests, to invite everyone who's present to feel free and ask a question, or to be honest, this is a seminar, so you can also just introduce yourselves, say what you're working on. It doesn't have to be completely formal. I think that it would be nice if this, out of an informal situation, this leads to a kind of genuine conversation, so please don't be shy. So I'm going to read the comment by Rodrigo Faustini, who mentioned that he picked up reading about the Groupe des 10, that they were involved in the discussions around the Club of Rome and the limits to growth, a paper that inspired neo-Malthusian austerity governance directed towards the third world.
Yeah, I was aware. Yeah, it's true.
I don't know if that's enough to make you...
I don't know a lot about the neo-Malthusian austerity and this thing of the third world, so I don't feel entitled to talk about this, but it's an interesting fact. Yeah.
Oh, I just saw that there are actually people having their hands up, but I don't know in what order. I can't see it here.
I think Kent.
The first one.
Yeah, Michael Goddard second, yes.
Okay, Michael, do you want to? Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I think Kent was.
Kent was first?
Yeah, I think so.
Just spreading some chaos here. Kent, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I don't mind if Michael wants to go first, but I just, yeah. Can you hear me, actually?
Yeah.
Yes, hi. No, thank you to brilliant talks. I really love this idea of noise as a kind of strategic metaphor, and I kind of wanted to just ask a question, kind of probing this idea of like the strategic and in relation to the idea of, as you were saying, noise is an impure concept, because I guess, when you spoke about the impurity of noise, you mentioned this idea of the possibility of it being an epistemic obstacle, right? And it's perhaps a bit of a banal example, but I was thinking of when I first started trying to research noise. And it took me quite a while to realize that when I was using search engines to look up noise, it was actually taking the synonym of sound and just like searching that for me. So I was getting loads of sort of like a very noisy sort of set of results on Google search because it kept on coming up with sound. And I was thinking, suddenly realized the kind of like, yeah, as you said, the noisiness of the concept of noise and its sense of like unwieldiness, if you see what I mean. And so when you talk about noise as a kind of strategic metaphor, what would it mean to think of, like, when is noise an unstrategic metaphor? When does it become sort of so diffuse as to kind of what's the risk and the danger of when it becomes defanged? And I was thinking of, people have spoken about this in relation to affect and like how it becomes to mean kind of like everything, and it can mean kind of like disruption in every level. That's why I really like the idea of strategy. But just to probe that idea of strategy, what would it mean to say, in this case, noise is an unstrategic metaphor, not strategic from a sort of other side, or sort of like from a sort of a side that we would think of as abhorrent in the sense of like, police violence, for example, but an unstrategic, or sort of like a metaphor. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. Thanks so much for your brilliant talks. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's kind of unavoidable to be metaphoric to a degree when you talk about noise, but of course you can like privilege a single meaning and deduce others from it, like the noise concept of information theory is pretty dominant in a way. That I encountered like lots of academic talks where it's just like taken for granted that's like the proper meaning of noise, and that's I wouldn't say that this is a strategic use of metaphor in a sort of Machiavellian, how do you pronounce that in English?
It's difficult, no?
Machiavellian way. It's more like also like sort of an unconscious use of metaphor or something, but there's also always this difference between strategy and tactic. It has a lot to do with intention and situation that always has to be reflected at the same time. I mean, when somebody talks about noise in the sense of information theory and has a clear plan what he or her wants to bring across, that's maybe strategy, but in a totally not harmful way. And when the Home Secretary uses the term noise in a totally unclear way, I would say that is a strategy that is actually has the potential to be really harmful, especially in this case. So that's what I mean with sort of a mobility of the concept is always depending on situation and circumstance.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to jump right in?
Sure. So firstly, thanks for two really interesting talks. And I'm not the first person to say two talks rather than a talk and a response, because in a way they were just sort of completely different. But I did think that there was something in common somewhere. And maybe it's about this, this work to try and get out of these Manichaean ideas of oppositions between sort of noise and order, sort of chaos and structure, maybe also between or to sort of locate sort of one sort of perhaps noise as either the idea that conventionally it's seen as something bad to be avoided, but we like to see noise as something virtuous and good, etc. And just in the interest of throwing in third terms and unwanted parasites and such, and because I just did a seminar yesterday on the subject, is we were talking a lot about Steve Goodman's work about sonic warfare, and I was thinking about that during your talk, David, because of, you were quite literally talking about some of the same kinds of phenomena, and like the way that noise is not just used by people who are sort of artists or producing a certain sound world that they want to, inhabit, but also by power, as weapons, like you sort of demonstrated in that video, etc., whether they're, sonic booms, all those different kinds of things. And you can sort of say that, there is a kind of, I sort of think from Miguel's paper, we've got the sense of the way that these sort of cybernetic theories, kind of become part of a sort of technocratic sort of regime for power, which you could say again, the noise is on the side of power rather than on the side of the resistance or the outside, or is seen as a good thing in itself, and then has all kinds of consequences. And what I sort of thought was interesting, looking again at Goodman's sort of ideas, is the way of basically saying, well, he didn't want to talk about noise as such, but how the way that noise is extended into rhythm, and the way that rhythms sort of constitute territories in different ways, I think precisely as a way of navigating between all these kinds of sometimes very stark sort of opposition, but by using concepts like rhythm and also vibration, I guess. So rather than just being about noise or silence or, different kinds of noise, but actually being about, the way that things actually operate vibrationally and also, rhythmically, and how that works on the kind of, political scale. And if we go to things like linguistics, for example, there's a lot of the things about how the refrain, creates territories in certain kinds of ways, or certain kind of different kinds of ways, and it's about different kinds of rhythms, different kinds of speeds and slownesses, and so forth. So I sort of wondered how that might fit within the kind of accounts that you were giving in both of your talks.
Do you want to go first, Miguel?
You touch a lot of different points. Actually, I don't know where to start, or what can I say that you didn't explain more or less. And basically, I agree with your points. I don't want to. If David, if you have a more elaborated thought on this, you can jump in.
Sonic warfare was definitely an inspiration when I started to think about noise like 10 years ago, approximately. I have to sort of reimagine the structure of the book a bit. And I met him once, and I sort of asked him, because I invited him to this Noise Existence festival, and we had a little chat about noise, and he explicitly stated that he wanted to avoid the term in his book because it was basically because of genre, because he didn't want to refer to that because it doesn't fit into his aesthetic program. That was one of the reasons, but also sure, if you talk about rhythm as vibration, I think noise falls a bit out of that sphere, because if you talk about vibration as rhythm, you are in a very sort of in a way traditionally musicologist space, because rhythm translates to frequencies, and to create a rhythm that's actually rhythmic, if you pitch it up several times, it becomes a musical interval, which is sort of harmonic. So it's in this, it's very much in the logic of consonance dissonance. And if we talk about noise as an acoustic phenomenon, it's sort of beyond consonant dissonant. Because in white noise or pink noise, you're no longer in the logic of intervals, musical intervals, and so on, because it's always frequencies jammed into the same signal.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more in the social idea of rhythm. That's more like Lefebvrean kind of idea of rhythm analysis, etc. That social life operates. It's another way of thinking sonically in relation to politics. That's maybe kind of leads to different kinds of places, but it's fine if it doesn't really relate.
Right. There's Inigo.
Cecilia. Oh, yeah.
There's Inigo who wanted to say something. I think he raised his hand.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. How are you?
Hi. Thanks for both your talks. It's great. So I've missed some bits of it, but I've heard most of it. I just wanted to bring up this idea from Carnap of explication, and to see how that might fit in or provoke some discussion. So I guess what I'm thinking of here, I saw somebody tweeted this little thing of reply of Carnap to Strawson today, and it was interesting to me. So where kind of Strawson's objection to Carnap's explication was this, that he's kind of changing the subject, right? That the explication of a concept is when it's the scientific kind of concept is something different from the ordinary usage of the concept, right? So it's just changing the subject. And then Carnap kind of replies, well, look, the ordinary usage is something like a pocket knife, right? It's got 100 different uses. But then the scientific concept is a specialized instrument, which we, so you don't kind of then, the idea is not that you are replacing the pocket knife with the specialized tool, but the pocket knife is not going to be good for your specialized application either, right? So then I guess my worry is with this, I think in a lot of humanities or sound studies texts on noise, there's this kind of tendency to think that, because there's multiple kind of uses of the term noise in ordinary language, then the narrow kind of scientific uses of it are somehow incorrect or missing the point or something like that, right? And so, I don't see why we can't have the pocket knife and the tools, right? And also, like, what's interesting to me is, like, how can we lay out all of these specialized tools and understand them in relation to the pocket knife? And so, like, the messiness of the concept of noise in ordinary language discourse, I think, is, infinitely interesting. But, I don't think it kind of undermines any of the specialized applications in the technical usages of the term. And in fact, I think there's like a really kind of, an ongoing interesting debate that's brought up by the different uses.
We lost you, Inigo. We cannot hear you. Inigo, we cannot hear you.
Chimes. I wonder whether that chimes with, or whether, what you thought about that, David and Miguel.
We unfortunately lost like your last 3 to 4 sentences because your audio cut out.
What was the last bit I was saying? Sorry.
Have both the pocket knife and the specialized tool.
Oh, so yeah. So what? Just that. I think there's an interesting way in which kind of those different tools, the development of those different tools in technical usage, are able to further our understanding within ordinary usage, and not just to close it off, but to kind of add to it, right? And so I don't. I'm not sure that I would think of the concept of noise as, only in the interstices, but also kind of, they're precisely in kind of delineating specifics, right? In technical usage. So, I don't think they're opposed, these things. I think they're all part of the productive kind of development of the multiple uses of the concept.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Best thing to have would be a pocket knife made up of very specialized tools.
Yes.
Which is, to a degree, what happened with noise as a scientific concept. Like Cecile wrote a lot more about that than I did. But for example, when Claude Shannon developed information theory, how he took the concept of entropy from thermodynamics and applied it to his concept of communication. And what was it? He got rid of the Boltzmann constant K and made the concept of entropy basically applicable to everything. This ontological arbitrariness. Did I get that right? That's something where I always stumble because I'm mathematically illiterate.
Actually, can I chip in with this?
Yeah,
Nobody raised a hand or something like this. I love this idea of the pocket knife with specialized tools. And I think it joins up quite nicely with this idea of a strategic use of multiplicity to a certain extent. The thing that I find interesting about scientific concepts is their relationship with metaphor to the extent that not all scientific concepts are mathematized and formalized in a way that is independent of its applications or use. So as you said earlier, if the Macy conferences, for instance, introduce a certain Manichaean logic, a kind of symbolic order to a certain extent that is indebted to theology, practically, what is the point at which scientific concepts lack the dexterity of both understanding the metaphorical dynamics that somehow partake, at least in shape the way that concepts are used and inserted into discourse, in the way that science is communicated to the wider public. For instance, if you're in literature, if you do poetry, if you do literature, and to a certain extent philosophy and theory, there's a very heightened and self-critical awareness of the culture of metaphors that you use. And when it's not there, it's sometimes very boring. But I think there is that knowledge, whereas in science, I think the assumption that there is no metaphor to worry about because you're talking about science and facts. To a certain extent, I think this is something that makes this dynamic multiplicity interesting.
Yeah, I agree. That's the productivity of it. Yeah. But to me, like the metaphorical diversity of noise doesn't, in ordinary usage, doesn't cancel the technical brilliance of the concept as it's elaborated in various kind of scientific means, and likewise that those technical usages don't eliminate the natural language one, but then there's a productive interplay, and that comes from both sides.
But I think we need actually to demand, as you said, this explication, because otherwise is when we move towards a production of over mystified notion that has nothing to do. Depends on your agenda, because obviously scientific notions are there to create certain models that provide accuracy so we can produce and gain knowledge from the world. We need these models to be, I guess, as accurate as possible to bridge the gap between ourselves and the world. But then the way in which this operates in natural languages or culture is completely different. The example of the tools is quite good. I mean, the application field, obviously, of thermal noise is not the same as the limit of measurement of a technological device is not the same as, let's say, the destruction of the future states of a missile system for cybernetics.
Totally. Yeah, and I think the examples you gave about Atlan and Ser and Atali are exactly pertinent to this. This is where explication, the proper uses of the scientific concept needs to come back and say, hang on, no, this is taking the metaphor too far.
Yeah, I think so.
What do you mean with taking the metaphor too far?
Oh, just so it's as Miguel explained, it's parasitic on the scientific concepts in a way that is that then kind of takes them beyond their application. So it's. The tools are good for what they were intended to use for, but then you don't use those tools and then jam them into your pocket knife as if they're capable of kind of serving all those diverse needs. And no, because there's the pocket knife and the tools specialized.
You make it sound as if there were two sets of language, and it's interesting in that respect that you think about Carnap, because for scientific language to be uncontaminated, if you like, by common language and its metaphorical dynamics, you would need to have a completely pure language, which to a certain extent with mathematics you have. And the moment, though, you translate this into discourse and you use metaphors like noise to signify that you're referring to a mathematization or formalization that you I think there is an element of translation there that makes also scientific language and the concepts it uses beyond its mathematical formalizations vulnerable to oracle distortions, and vulnerable in the sense that they're not aware of its strategic use. It's not like a writer who strategically uses a metaphor, but when you are, now I know what I want to say. The metaphors in scientific discourse, to a certain extent, make it vulnerable to what Althusser called the spontaneous philosophy of scientists. Is when you don't sufficiently question the language that you use, or you pretend that it's transparent and that it means only what you think it means, then I think you have a certain element of vulnerability to ideological infiltration that is less given when you have a culture of, sensitivity and strategic use of metaphors. A lighter touch, if you like.
Should I say? I mean, just to give a little example here, like the concept, Conap's example of explication uses the concept of fish, right? So the pre-scientific concept of fish refers to all animals living in the sea, in water. And the scientific concept explicates it, by excluding aquatic animals such as whales and dolphins and so on, right? Nobody now would say, this is a kind of, the scientific usage of the term is too narrow, and why can't whales be understood as fish? But also if we use a poetic metaphor about fish and involving aquatic animals that are not exactly scientific fish, that's fine. But the mix-up of the scientific kind of term and it's just. We shouldn't. The problem is where kind of that there's this. I guess. Well, with the term noise, it's so much more complex than the term fish, right? Because of those.
That's what makes it interesting. But the way you say it, for instance, the feminist critiques of biological explanations of the fertilization of the female egg. Have shown just how politically motivated, ideologically motivated the language is that is used in scientific discourse to talk about biological processes, especially biology. I mean, but you called it the wild empiricism. I'm not sure to what extent that really saves us from saying this is a language that doesn't need to concern itself with the metaphors that infiltrate it.
No, it precisely is. I think that's why you need to have kind of criticism of science that's from outside of science, and also kind of that's the productive interplay. I wouldn't say no to that at all.
Do we move on to? I think there was somebody else had their hands up. This was. I can't. I see L, but I don't see a name. So L.
Yeah, I think.
Shall I come and join in? Oh, it's K. It's cool. Lawrence. No, it's.
So I think exactly at the point with the fish, I think the metaphor of the tool and the pocket knife in science becomes kind of problematic because we're speaking about taxonomy in the end. And if we concern gender and sex, for example, I think what Judith Butler is doing and what people from gender studies are doing is basically providing the concept of noise in the concept of gender. And therefore, we leave this narrow linear thinking of male and female in two opposed poles. And it's even kind of too simple to say it's two poles with something gray in between, I would argue. Therefore, I think this tool is kind of problematic way of thinking this. And what I really would be interested to ask to David Wallraf is how noise for him is maybe related to the heterogenic material with Georges Bataille, and therefore maybe more with the question, for example, of vomit, some mass that is combined in a way that we can't really figure out how to get it apart again. We can't really understand what is inside the vomit in the end. What is that if something is digested, for example, which I think is related a lot to what is happening with social processes also, that we can't really understand it in a cybernetic way of thinking in nodes, and that's exactly where protests come, something like noise itself.
Maybe I don't know if this is an adequate response. But I try. I sort of wouldn't consider noise, at least if we talk about it on a conceptual level, not as acoustic noise and so on, not so much as something that can be grasped as a substance, like it's below or beyond something that can be taken apart. Like if it has a place where it can be located, that was something I touched on in my talk. I think the space of the in-between or the inter would be the place, like you touched upon the question of gender. Maybe that would be sort of a similarity, like an in between, which is not really there to bridge two poles or something, but touching on them or not touching on them, depending. Something which is much more, which has more mobility and openness, maybe, because definitely not like substance, which is stuff that's identifiable easily. I'm struggling a bit with language at this point. Sorry about that. It's definitely more heterogeneous than homogeneous in the Bataillean sense. I would agree to that.
Do you want me to go on with the comments in the side? Is there nobody with a hand raised? No. Tobias Eve said it could be argued that unsound does a lot of the same work for Goodman that noise does for Cox et al. So Tobias, I don't know if you're happy to join in. We could, if you want to make your point yourself. Otherwise, if the others want to respond to it. I don't know if you can see that in the side. It could be argued that unsound does a lot of the same work for Goodman as noise does for Cox et al. And you've got Michael Goddard's comment beneath saying, I agree, and I think that it is an interesting point of translation between EDM versus noise scenes and thought, and maybe even between crew or CCRU and other forms of cybernetic thought. I'm really intrigued to hear more.
I think we were just riffing by this point in the chat, so...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's interesting to the speakers or not. But
No, it's interesting. I'm sure it is. It's interesting to me.
there's something about these different languages, I guess.
Do you want to riff with us? Or?
I mean, I think that what's almost more interesting is later in the chat we talked about the Michael asked if what's interesting isn't the theoretical delirium, which I understand and appreciate for sure. But I think the interesting thing that Lawrenson brought in is this question of whether Sayre's fuzzy logic and so many other fuzzy logics that try to do this overlaying, try to make a tool out of the pocket knife, whether that is something that makes, whether that's where it becomes unstrategic. And that's, again, like just referring back to what Inigo was saying earlier. There's there's something interesting there. Where is it that it becomes unstrategic? But I don't know, something that.
Does anyone want to respond to that? I think I then maybe say something, because I think that's a really interesting point on several levels. On the one hand, because it's not actually that fuzzy, because to a certain extent there's a kind of resonance effect where all the different ways of thinking about noise are brought into a kind of antagonistic logic to a certain extent. And I think in that respect, it's not necessarily one. It's not so noisy as a strategy. It's not as precise as scientific conceptualization at all, but it does have a certain reductive dynamic to it too. When you say all these different ways of thinking about noise are actually reducible to a particular dynamic that is applicable to a certain logic, and to probably the lack of precision in that field, that way of using that particular logic is a handicap for the strategic use of the concept of noise. There's Serena Smith also who talked about a small thought on the metaphorical. Is noise paradoxically operating as the stable placeholder in a messy field of ambiguity? So I think to a certain extent that is probably true for some approaches to noise, that paradoxically, albeit they seem geared towards multiplicity, have a kind of reductive dynamic at play. I don't know. Serena, do you want to come in and say something? No, maybe she's not here anymore. Okay. So Martin asks, maybe we need a dictionary of noise.
That would be great. And it would be different in every language to a degree.
Yes,
I was very disappointed that noise was not in the dictionary of untranslatables. Maybe we should suggest that we add an article for whatever next week.
Not? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. No, so what I mean is that, I mean, even in the two presentations, which I think we could call it that way, the difference in relation to referring to what noise meant, it was it was quite far apart, and it really depends whether you know what is being meant in a specific situation, that you can really either miss the point of the conversation or think something differently. And I think, I certainly will be very interested to actually have a tool in order to understand the different, ways in which noise is applied at a given moment, or how has it been. I mean, I think your book, Cecile, to a certain extent, really helps to do this, but a much more kind of hands-on book sounds like that it could be helpful, to not basically use noise, because noise is such a, it has to do also with the kind of lack or that which disturbs, clear definitions. So then it is, a term that it actually can be misunderstood, and it deals with this misunderstanding too. So, I mean, even though it might be, countering some of the conceptual uses of the term noise, but I think it could also be helpful to be more precise, or for people who are outside of the field to, basically understand a bit better, just the different uses. Yeah, that's what I meant.
I think it's very interesting, and actually we could do a glossary quite fast, no, between all of us. But in relation back to Inigo's point, I think depending on what sort of knowledge do you want out of the use of this, I mean, not only science provides knowledge. Obviously, we can gain knowledge out of the religion or the zodiac, but it's a different form of knowledge. Maybe it's not very good for prediction. Maybe it's not very good if you want to prepare a treatment for COVID-19, but it's a sort of knowledge. The problem here is, in my opinion, the way in which certain metaphors are produced, particularly in the field of humanities, out of this, they arise by contrast. And they use distraction in order to produce a sort of positive feedback loop in which a uniform attitude can be applied then as a sort of universalist concept. It's sad, but we need to specify, we need to clarify, because everything is blurred, everything is full of fog, and it's complex. We need to go to the specific area in which we need to understand what's the role of noise in here, in, let's say, the transmission of a message over a wire, or what's the role of noise in, I don't know, French literature in a particular period of time. There is no universal, I don't know, I find it problematic to feed this sort of magic term that can be, I don't know, an ontological reducer or something like that. I think you are mute, Cecile.
There's other questions. I'll come back to them, but just in relation to what you said, Iker is asking, do you want to ask it yourself, Iker?
I don't have much to add apart from what is there, but it's just a thought about that came from the dictionary of noise idea, and how would you translate into something a bit more theoretical, something which is also theoretical and also maybe a bit ungraspable because of its reach. But I don't know, just a thought.
Well, but white noise is like macroscopic uniformity, no? And that's all.
Well, but there's also the need for infinite energy to convey white noise. So
yeah.
At the same time, it's like something that has everything in it because it has all possible frequencies, or at least a random selection of frequencies. But because there are so many of them, it's meant to include everything in it. And how how would you translate such a concept into something a bit more philosophical, which I'm not that used with, and if you could make a comparison, maybe.
I think this is really tricky. I don't know if someone wants to try to explain this.
There's also the comment by Fidel Meraz, which I think fits this very well. Any language is more or less subject to the phenomenon of noise. I think if you look at Gaston Bachelard's account of phenomenological obstacles and the fact that scientific thinking in its objectivity has to often pass through metaphors which it doesn't recognize as metaphor until it becomes an obstacle. So in that respect, I think scientific language does have its space. The other thing about scientific language that I think is not sufficiently mentioned when scientific discourse is presented to the general public, especially, for instance, in the context of the cognitive neurosciences, is that when you make a model, its application is very strictly limited. You have criteria, you have kind of experimental conditions. You can't just say willy-nilly anything that is halfway related to whatever experimental whose validity you are arguing for. And this progress through narrowness, which obviously is not narrow as in for science as a field as a whole, but I think that is completely lost when people make statements about what a certain science can do. Like it can, I don't know, the neurosciences can explain all of thought, and completely megagalactic claims no scientist would make in a scientific publication unless they have powerful friends who will publish it. There's more here. In the text by Hans Langer on the application of gender. Ah, yes, thank you. Inigo. And then Klaus Frieler said, noise is basically just another word for probability. And it's a universal tool to describe anything by an observer to which noise and probability is relative. As a systems of interest is mainly in the beholder's eye. So the scientific notion of noise is applicable to everything. Is one possible way of describing things that might or might not fit empirical data, which is another question. And a scientific theory is only a model and thus also a metaphor in some way. Noise can be seen as a way of thinking about things. Did I read that too fast? Probably. Klaus, do you want to come in and explain what you meant? If you're still there.
He left.
To me, I don't think the concept of probability covers all of the meanings of noise that we've discussed, particularly the ordinary language uses of the term. It's certainly very much involved in a lot of the concepts, specifically the scientific ones. But I don't think it covers what noise is in its diverse uses.
Can I ask you then something, if nobody else, I hope I'm not ignoring another comment or something. Can I ask you, since you're both invited as speakers and thinkers and also as noisemakers or you tell me, noise musicians, noise artists, I'd like to know to a certain extent the difficulty of talking about the experimental noise practices. If you can, do you think about the connection between your theoretical work and your practice, or is it just And if you do,
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. I do think about this, but it's so personal, and as well, precisely because of this richness and these very different ways in which we can think about noise. Maybe this does not apply for any other noisemaker, so to speak. But yeah, I think for me, if I think about noise as a notion, I think about crisis, disruption, but as well making, and I think more or less the same when I am doing noise music. So yeah, there is certain crisis, certain disruption, and certain productive production, and obviously if it is consolidated as a music genre, well, obviously the sonic qualities are a little bit like irrelevant. It doesn't matter really if it is just a random, I don't know, whatever, white noise or an LFO, or it could be extremely codified as a musical genre. So I think there are things, music pieces that have a very narrow and specific structure and are much more noisy than obviously the sound of, let's say, a sonic weapon used for the purpose of doing a noise album, if you know what I mean. But I think for all of us, more or less, we think the same, no? Yeah, I think it's complex when you deal with the aesthetic quality of sound, okay? So when we think about noise artists, we think about people that they do sound, okay? So suddenly it's just all about producing sound waves, etc. This could be voice, so you have a speech and you have meaning out of a natural language. So this is complexified. But in principle, a noise artist could be someone doing, I don't know, landscape painting. I have no problems with this, if you know what I mean. But suddenly, I don't know why we think about a male guy with a distortion box. And I have problems with this. This is really problematic.
Yeah. Very much so.
So that's maybe why I don't feel so comfortable right now to talk about, okay, I write some stuff and I think about noise, and as well I do noise. This is a very coherent persona that I am projecting here. No, because maybe my music is not very noisy anymore, or not all of it, if you know what I mean. Because as you know, I do some stuff that it could be like industrial music that it's like a music genre for decades and decades. Sorry, David, I interrupted you.
No, I think I interrupted you. But I want to touch upon what you just said and maybe expand on it. It's like what I think about noise is sort of separated from what I do with it aesthetically. It just catches up at weird points, like in there's this sort of established genre thing like harsh noise or harsh noise war, which is like the complete reduction of musicality, sort of like an aesthetic dead end. You can't go any further in that direction, but it's sort of an interesting starting point for me. But then I always try to pick different routes from that starting point and arrive at something that is maybe a bit more traditionally musical, like discernible frequencies or rhythmic structures or whatever, and like escape lines or escape routes from that. I mean, the starting point is crucial, but the escape routes are too, because there's a whole bunch of unpleasantness around in harsh noise, like this I call it incel noise, all this martial industrial stuff and the people you need to block on Twitter. But sort of make this in a way freedom of decision making productive, like there's no musical rules, and then you can sort of invent your own, going from unstructured white noise. Like that's a bit where what I think about and what I do musically touch, like make things more complicated. Or try, at least try.
And can I ask you another question? It's really fascinating for me that the way that you're two forms of praxis, because theory is also, I think, a form of praxis to a certain extent. I think it is how they cohabit without necessarily having to be reducible one to the other at all. I wonder if that, to a certain extent, is an indirect answer to the question of strategic use of noise and a kind of strategic multiplicity. I don't know. In the question that Inigo raised with the specificity of scientific conceptual tools, I used a different word earlier, I wonder to what extent the relationship between making noise and making music has a problem that can help us to think about the relationship between this kind of pocket knife notion of noise and its formalization and conceptualization as a scientific high precision tool. I wonder if, I don't know if that made sense. If it didn't, ignore. By the way, if there's other, other people who want to answer this, everyone is very welcome to say how their own practice, and maybe I'm sure there's other people making noise, others making music and theory as well. If that speaks to anyone else, please join in.
I think, sorry. Yeah, it's regarding once again to the definitions, because I think it changes the attributes of what noise means, once it becomes more like, established genre, so it's very different, the use maybe of noise in sound or music, maybe 40 years ago that it is now. Now it doesn't have the, maybe disturbing, distorting, or qualities that it used to have. So it becomes another, thing. I think it changes the meaning. And this, I'm not sure whether this has been properly, spoke about it or qualified, or, but it's certainly, I think there are two different things, and maybe, we have to think about attributes, or the attributes changes.
Sorry, I can't unmute myself. Michael, did you want to come in?
Well, but yeah, also that, maybe it's not like that, noise was transgressive once upon a time 40 years ago, and now it's not at all, because there are sort of changing conditions and circumstances, and precisely this point about suddenly, because the last time there was a law where some kind of noise was sort of singled out as a culprit was probably when they had all kind of laws against illegal raves, and repetitive beats were seen as something that was a criminal act, to gather and have repetitive beats. But now we have another law that's basically saying certain kinds of, like, that basically the noise of protest is legal, and I sort of think that this must on the one hand have some potential influence on on sort of strategies and ways of making noise as a aesthetic practice, but also on strategies of using noise in a kind of protest situation. So if noise is being criminalized, and yet also the forces of order and policing and so forth are also deploying noise in all kinds of ways, what's the kind of strategic ways of using noise kind of counter to that? So I think these things are all quite interconnected. You know, what
I mean, we're
protests now if it's being specifically just defined as noise.
I think Cecile and Inigo and more people here that they study the impact of noise in the financial market. We can see examples of this disruption, what occur with the stocks of this video games company months ago. Well, more than a month ago. I don't know when we are in time because of this whole thing of the pandemic. Well, but at the beginning of this year. So yeah, any disruption, you can create different disruptions that could be considered noise. But I think it's in the same way that I think it's reductionistic to think about noise in terms just of probability, and so it's sort of reductionistic to think about noise in terms of particular sonic frequencies, etc. And I very much agree with Steve Goodman's refusal of the use of the term noise, because it's so instrumental for the police, the use of these particular sonic frequencies. They for them, it's not noise, obviously. For them, what they are producing is not noise. It's just a weapon that could be a sound blasting machine. For me, it's highly irrelevant, the notion of noise in the use of these enforcement techniques. It's something that it's painful and contains elements of what, in general, when we talk about loud sounds, that we say is noisy, I cannot hear you, etc. But they are not manipulating. Well, they are manipulating noise to some extent as a notion, I guess. Yes, it's unfair to say the contrary. But as the material that fits the weapons, I don't know if it is noise, the stuff that they are producing. I don't know, it's a square wave, or I don't know what it is in the different weapons, no? But it's a quite discrete, predictable outcome that they produce with these machines. It's not random, unpredictable. No, actually they know what they are going to induce in the protesters. It's under control.
But I think this brings us back also to something that David earlier said about the way that noise, in the way that you would like to prescribe it, the way that noise is used to project power. Why are there situations in which, for example, I don't know, mansplaining for me is a form of noise that is probably analogous to weapons, sonic weapons. Is the silencing of people in a conversation through, speaking loudly and speaking without stopping and without, openings to perspectives that don't fit the running paradigm of a conversation. So I wonder to what extent it would be a shame almost not to use the word noise here, when it is precisely interesting that you have manifestations of power where noise is used, positively, not obviously as a good thing, but positively in a strategic and decisive thing in a way. The aleatory effect of this, if you like, the randomness is more in the perception of the person who's exposed to it, who's, if you're exposed to these noise devices, I think to a certain extent you can be also relatively traumatized by it, depending on how powerful they are. As also, I think you can be, no, I'm not going to say that. Go ahead. Who else is?
Just wanted to say, and this is like knee deep in metaphor, but on one hand, what Miguel said, that the output of a device like the LRAD is, on one hand, it's sonically the opposite of noise because it's like a fixed frequency, simple waveform, which is just painful. But then you have this description of noise as loud or overpowering sound, or as a signifier of power. But then again, you have noise as something that you also find in silence. Like you hear, when everything's silence, you hear a noise in your ear. So you find some noise in silence, and silence can also be, in a way, powerful in politically charged situations. I was thinking back to 2013 when the Gezi protests in Istanbul were happening, and the police managed to quieten down the whole city. The riot stopped, and there was this one news story about this, I think he was a dancer and performance artist. It went around the world. He just went to this central square in Istanbul and remained standing there silently, because every other form of protest had been banned. And for some reason I cannot recall at this moment, he became this very iconic picture of the protests which just happened, and sort of carried that on. So there's this interconnectedness of using noise to silence somebody or something, and then a silence can remain, which is actually pretty loud in a way.
If I can go off on that, off of that, I think there is something really interesting about also seeing the development of noise in music is the best way I can sort of describe it right now, as going from this use of noise as a way of provocation, of like almost a Brechtian like Verfremdung technique, and then in the historical avant-garde where the type of noise that was used in music at that point was to rustle people up and to get them out of their seats and sort of in that way create a tool or an action, to a call to action. Whereas I think that some of the problems with talking about noise music, or the application of sort of very acoustic noise or white noise nowadays, is that tool is no longer has the same effect nowadays. It's become a genre, like David was talking about earlier, that has that can have certain associations and sort of some areas of Twitter or whatever, or it could, but that sort of idea of the political aspect of noise is maybe moved on to other genres at this point, where you can have more that sense of an active tool is maybe moved on to other places in music these days. That's just an unformed thought.
Yeah, what I in the meantime, I just want to respond to what Tobias said. This, and I think it kind of picks up this idea also of Miguel and David of a fleeting historical moment, that moment of noise that can't sustain itself as such. But my feeling is that it's still a singularity to a certain extent. It is an event. This what happened then, and I think even if we are metabolizing it now in a way that cannot perpetuate that same moment, I still think that there are consequences to be drawn from what happens when you talk about noise as noise and not noise as music or noise as art. And when you obviously then you start to wrangle with the kind of dialectical instantiation of that. But I still think that it's a really powerful moment in the history of cultural production. Ian is directing us to Ray Brassier's text on the musical genre. The genre is obsolete. It's and Erica, you're not there, are you?
Just could I say, whilst we're waiting for Erica to turn up, I think we can think about, a simultaneous elaboration of what the concept of noise means in science, politics, art, or aesthetics, and so on. They're all elaborating what the concept means, and I think that what I forget who was mentioning it. Martin was talking about this. What noise is musically is so different now from what it was before, and I think that's specifically a kind of a musical elaboration of the concept of noise, and that's not unconnected. It's happening at the same time politically, because there's a political ramification of the musical concept of noise that is, so this is the, productive interplay, I think, where you get this kind of, and it's because of, I guess, again, we come back to this strategic ambiguity kind of thing that we're able to do this, right? But that's I guess what's really interesting in this kind of endlessly fruitful discussion of noise.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to a certain extent, this master metaphor has probably already outlived itself, and it's a matter, I think, of valorizing the singularity of a historical moment, of a form of conceptual event that, even though it cannot be perpetuated as such, and there is probably no future as such of noise studies, I think it would befall the same fate as noise music to a certain extent. But but something definitely happened there. I think it's worth looking at the consequences of that. Erica is here. She says the gentrification of noise. Martin says we have to be wary of the gentrification of noise. One thing you could ask yourself is, if you used the arsenal of mathematized, formalized conceptions of noise and tried to talk about music, what would they contribute, or how? Or in fact, I mean, we do it to a certain extent, I guess, to the extent that technologies are involved that operate on the basis of those concepts. So there is a relationship, but it's a kind of oblique one, I guess. Oh, Michael Goddard says, I would sign up for noise studies as opposed to sound studies. I think it would be a lot of fun. Oh, wow. Erica, you were there and now you're not there. Are you there? Are you back? Erica? Matsunami. It's the noisy, the noisy silence of Erica. Guys, we've run over quite a bit, so I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, I talked, but my mic doesn't work. Oh no, what a pity. Do you want to type something in the comments? Okay, guys. I think we've had a really productive discussion. I'm always worried that there's going to be silence. I gotta go, but thank you so much, Tobias. Okay, thank you to everyone who joined. This is really cool. I would normally say, I can keep the channel open for you guys, but I've had my AstraZeneca vaccine yesterday, and at first I thought, oh, it's no big deal, I didn't feel anything, but now I'm feeling actually quite bluish and feverish. So.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
thanks
have
to
to get
everyone.
home before the curfew. Whoopee.
Oh no.
I don't know. I think you're still contagious, aren't you? Despite being vaccinated, but less, I guess. So if everyone around you is vaccinated, they're also less exposed. But God, I have to say, I'll be glad when that spook is behind us. I hope I'll still be there for the next seminar. And not get some kind of deep thrombosis in my brain or something like this. No,
no.
I've been told that this is bullshit. I'm married to a health practitioner who, unless he wanted me to disappear, he said, no, go and do it. It's no problem at all. I don't know if it was pushing me in the deep end there. Anyway.
We just have to live with our noisy parasite of the virus or the antibodies or whatever.
Oh no! I think there's plenty of viruses.
I'm being very fuzzy, quite deliberately.
I think there's viruses in our DNA and all the viruses that surround us. We are totally and utterly outnumbered by viruses.
That's the real noise.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. Okay, do you want me to leave the channel open for you guys to get a glass of wine and to have a chat? I might join you again a bit later, but or you're all a bit tired now.
Yeah.
I am tired, I have to say. And you, David, you have to go back home before curfew. It's for real, no?
I will get into the curfew, but I can say, well, I was working if the police catches me, whatever. But
super weird.
That was clarifying the concept of noise for you.
Yeah, it's just an anecdote for closure. A friend from Berlin told me this, that before the curfew, when people gathered in public spaces and behaved noisily, and the neighbors called the police, they have this new strategy that when they are caught because of nuisance in the public, just people sitting around and drinking whatever, a police car drives up, turns on the siren, leaves it on for 2 minutes. People haven't left, then they get out of the car and deal with it personally. But imagine you call someone complaining about noise and the police arrives and just turns on the siren for a couple of minutes.
They caught on quickly.
Yeah. Don't get out of the car. Whatever. So I have to go. It was a total pleasure being here, there, and talking to you all, and especially listening. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all of you.
Okay.
Yeah, that was really brilliant. I also have to say a big thank you to the participants who joined in, because I know that the harsh wall of awkwardness to join a Zoom or MS Teams call like this is really quite something to break through, especially if you don't know people personally. So I really appreciate that. It's that's the whole point of the seminar. I hope that we can do it in person soon.
I hope so. Yeah. And to see you guys, it was nice to see you, even though it's through a screen.
Yeah, thanks. It was really great.
Yeah, brilliant to see you all again. So
have a good evening, people.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.